Thank you for coming. I started out about 35 years ago dealing with this issue. How you get kids with disabilities integrated with their peers so that they can have a social network as they move through the grades and on into some meaningful life after school. And kept bumping it. Our kind of gut level response is this is what we should do. But we found tremendous obstacles. You know, it was just always this uphill battle of trying to bump up against these bureaucracies, which we had created, you know, for good reasons, but which didn't lend itself to this kind of activity. And so then when Madeline Will became assistant secretary, and during the Reagan years, we were able to get some data. And finally, and the research data that was surfacing around the country supported our initial assumptions that in fact kids get better outcomes. And this is something that should be policy. But nevertheless, it continued to be an uphill battle for reasons that take too long to get into here. I decided to, beginning about 1998, to ask a different question. And that question was, is there something that we can do that would attract the interest and enthusiasm of general education for having kids in special education be a part of what general educators do? In other words, being in grade level instruction and having. And the answer from general ed has always been as long as there's appropriate resources and supports and somebody who knows what they're doing with this population, then we have no particular objection. We decided to see if we could create an organizational structure for education in general that would benefit all groups. And in fact move us a little bit away from this medical model idea of disability, and say, you know, rather than focus on properties of the child, something that's in the individual, why don't we look at the ecology that the individual child is involved with, and see if we can provide an instructional match. In other words, can we understand what a child needs to benefit from the general educational curriculum, and then provide resources and supports to match that need. The important thing to consider here is for all kids, you know, not just for kids that are second language or kids that are labeled with disability, and so on. And what I want to share with you is the structural elements that we've evolved now in that process, and then I'll show you some data that we think begins to answer the question, can it actually do something for both kids with IEPs and kids who don't. We started off in Kansas City with 2 schools, and things went very well there. We started then on the heels of a lawsuit against the Ravenswood City School District in East Palo Alto in California. We came in under a court order to see if we could help them restructure their schools, because you know, they were doing terrible in both general education and in special education. And so the judge, the federal district court judge out there said, let's see if we can revamp the whole thing. And I'll show you some data from Ravenswood that you know, I think are hopefully you'll find pretty impressive. On the basis of the work in Ravenswood, we were also then invited into New Orleans following the hurricane, and we spent 2 years helping Recovery School District with some schools reorganize their supports and services and move in that whole school direction. And then most recently, we're now in our 3rd year in Washington, D.C. schools. We have 16 elementary schools in D.C., and those basically what D.C. is doing is replicating what happened in Ravenswood. So the punchline at this point is it works. That's the good news. The bad news is it takes time. It takes a minimum of 3 or 4 years to begin to create the structural changes that are needed for all kids to be able to demonstrably benefit. And demonstrably benefit means academic, measured, grade level annual test performance. So the outcome question is, can we get statistically significant increases in kids in general ed grade scores and also the subgroups, which includes special education. Here's what SAM does. We call it, it's a school-wide applications model, and we call it SAM for short. It integrates special education with general education for all students. So one way to think about it is sort of all kids get the benefit of special ed, and all kids get the benefit of general ed. So it blurs that distinction to the maximum degree that you can under existing federal statutory and regulatory requirements. It's a school-wide response to intervention model, and if that's a new term to anybody, please bring me your card after the meeting and write that on the back of the card, and I'll send you more information about what that's all about. Or with any of the technical terms that I'm using up here, I'd be happy to provide that. We look at both behavior and academics. What we find is in lots of inner city schools and in schools in high poverty environments and so forth, because of the stresses in the community and lots of factors, the kids are not able to respond to the teaching learning process from day one. And so we factor teaching, social development and behavior into the curriculum. And we do so in accordance with that three-tiered RTI model. We have a fidelity estimation tool, which we use to tell us the extent to which schools are making progress on implementing this school-wide model. And what that enables us to do is do research on this process. What's the relationship between increases in implementation and academic test scores and other outcome measures like school climate and so on. It is a cultural change approach, which is kind of anthropology in education. It's really looking at what is the impact of changing a dysfunctional culture in a school and helping it transform itself into a positive, energized culture. And we can measure that process, and we can see that increases in that cultural change are identified with increases in academic and behavioral outcomes. This thing will take me too long to explain, but it basically is the RTI model. A pyramid with academics on one side, behavior on the other, 3 tiers. The first tier at the base of the pyramid is interventions, educational, that apply to all the kids. Some kids won't respond. If we measure their progress in grade level instruction, they're going to start falling behind. And whether or not they have special education needs, they'll fall behind for a number of reasons. Those kids will be engaged in a more intensive level of instruction, what we call tier 2 in the response to intervention system. And again, if we're not making progress under more intensive interventions at tier 2, we'll engage even more intensive interventions at tier 3. And so kids, the main point of this is kids can move up and down. The force is always downward. We're always trying to get as many kids to respond to tier 1 interventions as we possibly can. So here are the organizational features, and I'll move really quickly on this. One is leadership. We're finding, our research shows that the site leadership at the school is hugely important. So we have to pay a lot of attention to principals. How do we train principals? What do they need to know? How do we evaluate them? A lot of schools we work with, nobody evaluates the principal. We need to really have a way of making sure that some of the things that we know energize education are being done by site leaders. Also, leadership has to be distributed at the school. So we need a leadership team. We need to have teacher leaders as well as the individual responsible. We need good curricula with evidence behind it that works. And so we take a look at the extent to which evidence-based curricula are in place in the schools we work with. And we talked about RTI. It's probably a very good organizing framework for getting both special ed and general ed on the same page. Because now we're not concerned with what's the disability and where should we have a separate place for kids with certain disability categories and all that. Instead, we're looking at what does this kid need in order to make the next jump into progress in the general curriculum. Early screening, frequent progress monitoring using valid and reliable tools is a component. Looking at school-wide positive behavior support as our way of dealing with behavior. We use positive behavior support. There's many of these intervention programs for behavior that are available. We like positive behavior intervention and supports because it's got the most evidence behind it. And it's continuing to build. It's a powerful intervention system, so we put that into place. It's a community school, which means that you know the school forms relationships with its community in low-income communities and inner cities, cores, and other places where there's high poverty and so forth. Often we feel that there has to be a connection between efforts to reform issues in the community and efforts to reform the school. So it's an interactive process, and we encourage those connections, and we're analyzing the extent to which that impacts student outcome. Families are huge in the process. So we have a major program to reconnect schools with their families and get the families involved in doing their share of the educational interventions and outcomes. We have a strong teacher support system that utilizes grade level teams. We use coaches, which is a relatively new organizational element that's paying off. We're seeing some real differences where, you know, it used to be when we did professional development, we'd get teachers in a room and do what I'm doing, give them a lecture and show them some stuff, and they get a notebook. But then we come back 6 months later and we find nobody's doing the stuff that we showed them how to do. So now we have a system in place where we give them the information, the knowledge, but then we follow up in their classrooms with people who are trained along with them and continue their training, and they're able to support implementation within the classroom of what they learn. A fully integrated structure that discourages silos. We call, you know, special ed for us is a silo, ELL is a silo, vocational education is a silo, gift is a silo. General ed's a big silo. Our effort here is designed to have a unified educational system with a universal design for learning that's applied to all students, and so we spend a lot of effort on that one. All kids in the general curriculum, it doesn't matter what their problem is. Kids with really significant issues will you know, marshal whatever resources at the third tier, the most intensive level of intervention, to have them engage as much as they can of their grade level curriculum. So it's you can imagine the most severe kid that you can think of, down to kids who are labeled as having learning disability or ADHD or something like that. You know, the whole spectrum of those kids for us is a matter of match. What do we need to engage this child to the maximum extent possible? And we answer that question as to how they're doing with progress monitoring.